Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. One of the things we don't often see or hear about after disaster is the role that an arts and creative community can play in the recovery. Today I'm talking with Scotia Monkivitch. She's the Executive Officer of the Creative Recovery Network in Australia. It's a unique program that I've not seen elsewhere in the world. So stay tuned and learn more about what she's doing and perhaps what your community can do in order to replicate something like this. Hi, Scotia. How are you today?
Hi, great. Thanks so much for coming along and saying hello.
Well, so before we get started, could you just tell the viewers a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Scotia. Today I'm in Australia. I'm on Turrbal and Yagara country, which is Brisbane. It's the top end of Australia, and I'm an artist. I'm a performing artist, but a lot of my work has been working with community. And so since in 2011, Queensland, the state I live in, had a statewide flood. And out of that flood, I was employed on a project to look at the role arts and culture could play as part of disaster recovery, and particularly disasters of such a noted size. And so out of that work over the years, we did a lot of research about what else is sort of happening in Australia. We have a long history of cultural arts practice, community arts practice here in Australia, and we evolved a network called the Creative Recovery Network, which is advocating and supporting the role of arts and culture in disaster recovery, knowing the vital role that culture and the arts play in communities generally, that when they're in times of vulnerability and trauma, we can play a very, very strong and future-thinking role.
Well, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about in this episode is about the Creative Recovery Network, because this is the first one I've come across in my work, and I'm just curious to know how it works, how it was funded, who started it, those kinds of things.
Well, it started back in 2011, as I was saying, with this pilot, which was funded at that time by the federal arts government and the state arts government collaboratively. And through that pilot, we were able to talk to a lot of people and acknowledge the work that had been going on. We had very big fires in Victoria called Black Saturday fires a couple of years earlier, major floods in WA. We're, as you would know, a large country, and we are often beset by disasters, but there hadn't really been any coordinated work in this space before. And often artists, as we found out, were put into communities to say, well, support them or fix them in some way, but with no adequate training and no understanding of where they fitted within the disaster management system. And so often in themselves ended up with quite a lot of vicarious trauma and not necessarily always doing the best job that they could. So by doing that research, we found there was sort of obvious gaps. So one was around training, one was around having champions in emergency management to support our work and to promote the vital value and the role that we could play, because emergency management tends to, or it's shifting and changing, but comes very much from a call and command place, and it doesn't necessarily always contain recovery. That's shifted in Australia. It's much more emphasis now that emergency management follow through with recovery.
Yeah.
And so they don't necessarily know or understand or connect with the arts or with cultural frameworks. So it was a big educative process. So we realised we had to be much stronger at being proactive in bringing ourselves into their space, educating them about the tools and the values that we could bring to the work, and then start to find how we sort of fit it into their system whilst perhaps challenging new modes of working.
So explain kind of some on a practical, real level. So in a situation where you would go in, so what are the kinds of things you would be doing?
Okay, so just to finish answering before that, I realised I didn't say that we're funded by the Australia Council, which is a federal arts funding body. We've got a very big country, but we only have funding for one person, which is myself. So we are trying to grow that. So in activation, in what we might call activation, we would require other funds that would come through the normal recovery process to fund workers. So I can give you an example of a project that we're rolling out now in Victoria, which is in the southwest part of Australia. There was a community in Gippsland that was impacted very greatly by fires last February. So we worked through Emergency Management Victoria onto their regional recovery committee. So in Australia, when, each state and territory is different, but we have if a fire is of a particular size, and particularly if it crosses borders, shire borders, they create a regional recovery committee, which services and gives an overview of all of the work that's happening across those communities. So the three in this instance are called Bor Bor, Cardinia, and Latrobe City shires. So through that regional recovery committee, we were able to facilitate across those three shires some funding for a project to support the capacity building of local artists to lead and develop creative recovery work. So we've just had an EOI. We are bringing in a mentor, someone who is very experienced in working in this space. Her name is Amanda Gibson, and she's developed a lot of work as a visual artist through being impacted by the 2009 Black Saturday fires. She's also coordinated a lot of projects on the ground consequently. So she's coming in to mentor 9 artists, 3 from each shire, to be able to become community leaders or activists in their community, to develop cultural and creative projects, to help facilitate them, support the funding of them, and to support the implementation and rollout. So in that instance, we were able to build in long-term capacity in those communities, and particularly through the arts sector, to be able to be there as creative responders into the future, at the same time responding to the particular event that has impacted that community. So it's a really great model of responding in the instance as a lot of work happens. There's not always a lot of capacity building put into that. So from this, we build in long-term leadership for that community, which is pretty exciting.
Well, and I know, in the area that I focus on, the business and economic side, that's often forgotten as well. And so I sympathize with you, or empathize with you, trying to get into that emergency management piece, because it's often just overlooked. It's not seen as that important. It's an afterthought. But yet, there's certain elements, like the ones that you work on, the ones that I work on, that are critical to long-term recovery.
Well, it's about being community centered, and people need a place to be able to tell their stories. We learn by reflecting on our stories and formulating an understanding of our histories. And so, the arts is a beautiful tool to support that, to bring people together, to have a participatory process so people can do something creative and trigger away from their flight brain back into their problem-solving brain, and their capacity to be able to see beauty and therefore see hope for the future. I mean, all of those things and many more are activated through participatory engagement in arts and culture. And, that's, it's in all research, they say those things are vital for safe and healthy recovery, both at an individual and a community level. So,
Yeah.
It's a pretty beautiful contribution that we can offer to our communities.
Yeah, I think even from a trauma perspective too, I've seen where kids will draw what they saw and talk through it, and it helps them heal. And so even something as simple as that, being able to go through visual arts.
Well, to have a way to make sense of what is unimaginable. Like we don't ever have a frame necessary, a reference to understand the kind of trauma that we put in, and particularly when you think about the hugely impactful fires that we've just had in here in Australia. It's not just the people who were deeply impacted, but everyone carries a kind of vicarious trauma of the hundreds of images of burnt koalas and the destruction of our beautiful natural world. It's and the constant story and fear mongering that comes through media, unfortunately, more often than not. That how do we sift through that so we don't carry that burden of fear? It's one of the great challenges that we're looking at the moment. At a national level, how can the arts play a role in being that whole of community support or hear.
Yeah, no, that's great. So are you aware of any other similar groups as yours outside of Australia?
There's no group that we're aware of that's sort of functionally putting themselves in a kind of advocacy and a kind of structural way. So we're a not-for-profit organisation. We're structured under a constitution, and we've got a very clear national mandate through our funding that we have currently. I'm aware of different groups, and I'm certainly aware of a lot of work that artists have been doing across Australia. I'm aware of work that's happening in Indonesia and Japan and England and Puerto Rico and a whole lot of places. So probably there is a company called Capfiller in New Zealand who came out of the major earthquake there. And they have become and continue to grow from there. So they do a lot of work within the public space, looking at activating and access to public space. In America, a group called Burners Without Borders has sort of evolved from the Burning Man Festival after they got involved with the tsunami impact, and they have continued to kind of grow and look at ways that they can activate their members to do direct recovery response. The way that they work, they go in to look at clean up and building structural support, etc., and then work their art alongside. So they're sort of coming with a little bit of a different angle than us, but in principle activate as artists in the same way. There's a lot of interest, and I think there's a lot of instances where artists are activated and are active in their own communities or take work into work with communities outside of their own regions. But in terms of a coordinated organisation, no, I haven't come across yet.
So as far as say someone is interested in replicating what you're doing or getting involved with you, are there certain resources that you would refer them to, or should they go to your website, or what would you
Yes, certainly our website gives a little bit of a context of how we've sort of structured ourselves, and it is very specific to the needs of Australia, but I think that would be very common across other countries. And we are trying to build up a good library of resources on our website, so different documents. And again, they are Australia specific, but I think in general, they're a good way to at least drive ideas. One from America, not Canada, is a book called Arts Become the Oxygen, and that was produced by the US Department of Arts and Culture. So if you go to their website, you can download it as a resource, and it's a really beautiful sort of manual, I suppose, of how artists can and what their role could be, both at a community and a political level within disasters. In Australia, the AIDA, you spoke to Amanda Lamont some time ago, who works for AIDA. They have a number of handbook resources that aren't artist specific, but they are about community engagement, and they are really useful. And I think there are a lot of arts organisations in every country that sort of would have the skills necessary to coordinate and to formulate and certainly understand the potential of the role of the arts. And maybe it's a matter of finding some new avenue through those organisations that already exist.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, I mean, before we wrap up, is there anything else that maybe I didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention about the work you're doing?
No, I mean, we're really interested in looking at new partners and collaborators. So if there's anyone who is keen to contact us, please do. We're just starting the production of a podcast series. It's called Creative Responders, a little thing.
Great. I'll put that in the link too.
Yeah. It's trying to, I suppose a lot of our work is very intangible, and it's hard to kind of make tangible conversations and relationships. We certainly work from the point of view of relationship, and that's really vital in terms of finding ways of how you work and fit into existing systems. And so the podcasts are trying to make tangible some of the key focus areas that we're working with, but also give a bit of a sense of how we go about our work. So we're children and young people, First Nations and drought are kind of three key areas that we're trying to really investigate and work in very specifically. And then the fourth is around self-care and how do we put in structures to support our artists more effectively. And that's certainly a very strong drive of ours. How do we shift organisation structures and funding structures to ensure that they're adequately supporting artists, giving them effective professional supervision when working in very traumatised communities, and have a broader remit to have better outcomes all around.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Scotia, for taking the time to just explain about what you're doing and the important work that artists and the creative process can have when people are recovering from a disaster. We'll for sure put some resources on the description below in the video. And I wish you all the best in your work in the future.
Thanks, Leanne, and you too. Sounds a very exciting project that you've got here. And I've been looking at some of your videos and congratulate you on your work.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.